So in Macbeth, Shakespeare wrote famously, "Each new morn, new widows howl, new orphans cry, new sorrows strike heaven upon the face." It's one of the reasons why we need God's mercies to be new every morning, because every day is racked with trouble in one way, shape, or form. We are broken people living in a broken world with other broken people. There is nothing more certain than that you will suffer. It's inevitable. We can testify to that already. But when most of us think about suffering, we think of tragedies like death, like disease, like depression and divorce, the big stuff, crises. But as I said a couple of weeks ago, suffering is much bigger than that. Suffering's much broader than that. Everyday stuff like frustration, disappointment, anxiety, fear, insecurity, stress, sadness, my ongoing struggle with me, my ongoing struggle with other people, my ongoing struggle with God, my ongoing struggle with circumstances. It's all suffering. Relational strain, loneliness, this nagging sense of not enoughness, the feeling of being misunderstood, the feeling of being rejected, all of that stuff is suffering too. We all suffer. Pain is unavoidable. And when we do suffer, the first thing that most of us wrestle with is why? Why me? Why now? Why him? Why her? Why this? Why that? Why, God? Why? That's very natural for us to ask why when we are experiencing pain, when we are suffering. And when it comes specifically to God and our pain, we wrestle with how God can be totally good and totally in control. Now, the Bible makes it clear that God is both of those things all the time. He's totally good and he's totally in control. But when we look at the world around us and when we look at our own lives, we struggle to come to terms with the fact that God is both totally good and totally in control. Because if he's totally in control, then he must not be totally good. And if he's totally good, then he must not be in total control. He can't be both. Just look around at the world. Look at our lives. How can God be both good and in total control? If he's in total control and he can prevent all of this stuff from happening, then he's not good. And if he's good and he doesn't want all this stuff to happen, but he can't do anything about it, then he's not in total control. He can't be both. Well, this emotional dilemma, wrestling with how God can be both good and in total control, this emotional dilemma reveals that we assume suffering is ultimately bad. Because of the pain of it, we assume, understandably, that suffering is ultimately bad, that pain is ultimately useless. And because we conclude that pain is ultimately useless and that suffering is ultimately bad, we conclude that God must not be either totally in control or totally good. We read Job's story and we think to ourselves, what kind of God is this? Okay, now if you're unfamiliar with the story of Job, the first 2 chapters tell us about who Job is and what Job suffered. The first 5 verses of chapter 1 tell us that Job is a good guy. It explains very clearly in those first 5 verses of chapter 1 that Job isn't suffering because he's being punished for doing bad stuff. Job's actually a good guy. He's a righteous guy. He's got a good reputation. He's a moral guy. He's a good father. He's a good guy. And then the story goes on and says that in some unseen place, wherever God was, the devil shows up. And he begins mocking God. And God says, essentially to the devil, you think people worship me only because I give them stuff. And the devil says, that's exactly what I think. He said, Job, for instance, the whole reason Job loves you and follows you and worships you is because you've made him rich, is because you've given him a lot of stuff. You've blessed his life. And so God says, okay, I'm going to prove to you that that's not true. So I'm giving you permission to go afflict Job. And so the devil goes and he afflicts Job. This is in the story. He goes and afflicts Job and He strikes his kids dead. He gives Job all sorts of diseases. There's all sorts of bad stuff that happens. Job suffers calamity after calamity after calamity. And he doesn't just go through one round of this stuff. He goes through 2 rounds of this stuff, because chapter 2 talks about a whole other round that the devil gives Job, that God gives the devil permission to go and afflict Job with. So you read this story, and I've had conversations with people for years about this story, and they go, what's the deal there? God seems so heartless, so callous. Job is this good guy, and he's minding his own business, and in some unseen place, the devil shows up and challenges God, and God uses Job to prove a point twice. This just sounds so heartless. So callous. Who is this God? If this is who God really is, I want nothing to do with this guy. It's like he's playing loose with our lives. He's just treating us like pawns in his own game. What kind of God is this? It's an understandable question. But it only sounds like God is careless and heartless and callous in these circumstances if we assume that the suffering Job is about to experience is ultimately bad for him. But what if what comes out of Job's suffering proves to be ultimately good for him? Maybe God's not heartless and callous. Then, what if God allows Job to suffer because in the end, Job will be more free? Job will be more alive. Now, before we explore that any further, I need to point out a big theological problem here, okay? It appears to be a theological problem. It's not ultimately a theological problem, but it appears to be a theological problem. The verse that I just read, Job chapter 1, verse 21, Job says, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." And you want to say, now hold on a second. The Lord didn't take anything away. The devil took it away. What's Job saying there? Is he confused? Does he just not know what's going on? The Lord has given, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Wait, well, hold on. I thought the devil took this stuff away. Satan took it away. Now, to compound this problem, we have to flip all the way back to Job chapter 42, the end of the book. Job chapter 42, verse 11. It says, well, I'll start in verse 10. "And the Lord restored the fortunes of Job when he had prayed for his friends. And the Lord gave Job twice as much as he had before. Then came to him, to Job, all his brothers and sisters and all who had known him before and ate bread with him in his house. And they showed him sympathy and comforted him for all the evil that the Lord brought upon him." You're like, well, hold on a second. That verse shouldn't be there. The Lord doesn't bring evil into our lives. There are other sources by which evil comes into our lives, bad stuff, but it's not God. Well, to compound the problem even worse, I want to look at Lamentations, which is a book of the Bible in the Old Testament that I'm not even sure you know where it is. I'm pretty sure I don't even know where it is. Lamentations chapter 3, just kidding, I do. Lamentations chapter 3, verse 37 and 38. Now, this is just an example, a couple examples of these difficult places in the Bible that seem to indicate that God is the source and the author of trouble, of evil. Lamentations chapter 3, verse 37 and 38. "Who has spoken, and it came to pass, unless the Lord has commanded it?" In other words, nothing happens outside of God's control. That's what that verse is saying. "Is it not," verse 38, "is it not from the mouth of the Most High that good and bad come?" You go, okay, this is exactly why I don't like God. It's why I don't believe in God. It's why God frustrates me because of this kind of stuff. It's like he's playing fast and loose with our lives. As I said before, it's like we are pawns in his game. He's trying to prove his point to the devil in Job's case, and he uses Job to do it. And he allows all of this suffering and all this calamity and all this pain and all this loss to ruin Job's life. Why? To prove a point? Sounds so callous. Now, these passages that I just read seem to say that God is the cause of suffering, that he's the author of trouble. They make it sound like he's in total control, but that he's not good. There's no ambiguity here regarding whether or not God is in control. The question we now have is, does he care? Is he good? If God is in complete control of all things and my life feels the way that it does and the world is the way that it is, then it must mean that he's not good. But the Bible makes it clear that God cannot sin. Okay, so how is it that God can ordain that sin be without himself being guilty of sin? It's a huge theological dilemma, okay? And rather than avoid that stuff, we just look at it for what it is. It seems to be an apparent contradiction. It seems to be that maybe God isn't who we thought he was, or maybe he's not as good as we thought he was, or maybe he's not as in control as we thought he was. I mean, think about this. Could God have stopped sin from entering into this world? Okay, go back to Genesis chapter 3. God made the world and everything was good. And then Adam and Eve one day in the Garden of Eden decide, having been tempted by the serpent, decide they want to be like God. And so they eat from the tree. And as a result, everything good that God made is broken. Well, could God have stopped that from happening? I mean, was God in that moment beholden to free will, our free will, as if our free will is more powerful than God? I mean, could God not have stepped in and, just chopped the head off the serpent right then and there? Could he not have stopped it from happening? Well, of course he could have. I mean, he's God. He can do what he wants. So then why didn't he? If he could have stopped it, if he could have prevented this world from being such a broken place, if he could have prevented us from being such broken people, I mean, then why didn't he? Well, the Bible is relatively silent on that question. In fact, I remember hearing a panel discussion where this question was being discussed and debated by a handful of very well-respected scholars and theologians. And all of them, in that moment at least, had the humility to admit that they didn't really have an answer to that question. Could God have stopped it? Yes. Why didn't he? Well, as I said, the Bible's relatively silent, but we can say this, I think, that there are certain attributes of God we would never know if he had not allowed sin to enter into the world. Okay, you asked the question, let's make it a little bit more personal and a little bit less cosmic, okay? Why, if God is big and if God is in control and if God, the big Bible word for that is sovereign, if God is sovereign, and he's good, then why in the world would he allow this pain in my life? Why would she leave me? Why would he die? Why would this happen? Why would this catastrophe come knocking on my front door? Why? Could God have stopped all of those things from happening? Could he have given me a pain-free life? Could he have prevented these things from taking place? Of course, he's God. Let's acknowledge that it's something that we may struggle with, but let's not, in the process of acknowledging that, discard the fact that God is sovereign or that he's in control or that he's God. And so the only answer that the Bible kind of gives to that question as to why God would allow sin to enter into our world if he could have prevented it is because there are certain things about God, certain attributes of God, certain aspects of his character and who he is that we would never know if he had not allowed sin to enter into the world. For example, we would know nothing of God's redeeming love because there would be nothing we would need to be redeemed from. We would know nothing of God's mercy because we wouldn't need it. We would know nothing of God's forgiveness because there would be nothing for him to forgive. Almost everything we know of God, the beauty and the brilliance of his love and his grace and his forgiveness and his mercy, we know those things because he allowed sin to enter into this world. I mean, what's so, in the infinite wisdom of God, he takes all of this stuff that is intended to be bad and harmful, and he builds a platform with that to showcase who he is more and more. It's amazing that there are things about God there, and you know this to be true in other areas of life. I mean, there are certain things that you appreciate, certain things that you see, certain things that you now embrace because those things have happened against the backdrop of something bad, something painful. If you've ever lost anything significant in your life, for example, if you've ever gone through a real financial downturn, maybe you were making money and doing well, and then for whatever reason you lost everything or you lost a lot of it. And you finally get on the other side of that and you begin to recover and you start maybe making money again, you're a lot more appreciative of the money you have and a lot more careful with it. I remember hearing a story, I think it was Tim Keller who told this story about a dream he had where nightmare he had where his wife and children were killed by an intruder, and he woke up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat. And he said, I promise you, from that day forward, I loved and appreciated my wife and kids more than I did before. So we know this to be true, that there are certain things that we can now see, certain things that we appreciate, certain things that we hold more dear, because those things have happened against the backdrop of something hard or something painful, a loss, a catastrophe of some sort. See, God uses the bad stuff as his platform to show us more of himself. This is what he's getting ready to do in this story. He's getting ready to show Job and Job's friends and the devil himself attributes of his that would have otherwise gone unseen. That's why Samuel Rutherford said, when I'm in the cellar of affliction, I look for the Lord's choicest wines. I love that. When in the cellar of affliction, I look for the Lord's choicest wines. Martin Luther, my historical hero, said, suffering has made me a better theologian than any book I've ever read. And then he went on to thank those persecuting papists for making a relatively good theologian out of me. There is something about pain, loss, suffering, catastrophe that enlarges us and that helps us to see God in brand new, bright, and liberating ways. Now, knowing all of this doesn't take away the pain. I'm not for 1 second suggesting that when you are in the crucible of ache, you should have a smile on your face and go, well, God's going to do something good with it, so I'm okay. That's not a realistic, honest reaction to suffering and catastrophe. We don't find that in the Bible. We never see God sort of having this stiff upper lip posture toward those of us who suffer. It just doesn't. I mean, the Psalms are filled with prayers and petitions from the psalmist to God going, why? Crying, lamenting, complaining, arguing, weeping, grieving, all of those things that God allows, gives us the space to express. So knowing this doesn't take away the pain. But the last thing we want to do when we are in the crucible of ache is to discard or dismiss God's sovereignty. That's the temptation. The temptation is to go, well, I mean, when tragedy strikes, when bad things happen, that proves God's not in control. Well, that's the last thing we want to dismiss. That's the last thing we want to discard when we're going through something painful. Because God's sovereignty, his all-in-controlness, is a shock absorber when it comes to pain. Shock absorbers, as you know, they don't take away the bump altogether, but they do absorb the bump to the degree that the car doesn't fall apart. It absorbs the shock. One poet put it this way when speaking about how necessary and how comforting the sovereignty of God is when we're in pain, and how tempting it is to dismiss it, to discard it, to conclude that God's not in control. And he puts it this way: pain and loss are bitter providences. Who has lived long in this world of woe without weeping, sometimes until the head throbs and there are no more tears to lubricate the convulsing of our amputated love? But oh, the folly of trying to lighten the ship of suffering by throwing God's sovereignty overboard. The very thing the tilting ship needs in the storm is the ballast of God's good governance, not the unburdening of deep and precious truth. What makes the crush of calamity sufferable is not that God shares our shock, but that his bitter providences are laden with the bounty of love. Whew, I could read that over and over and over again. So rich, so powerful. What he's saying is, don't throw overboard the truth of God's sovereignty when you're suffering. In fact, it is the sovereignty of God that becomes a pillow that we can rest our weary, suffering heads on when we're experiencing calamity and loss. It's the ability to go, God, I don't know what you're doing. I don't know why you're doing it. I don't like it. But I find great comfort in knowing that you are good and you are in complete control, and that whatever's happening behind the scenes that I'm not privy to see is something that is ultimately good. Ultimately. It may not be temporarily good. It certainly may not feel good. It's not supposed to feel good. But ultimately, God is turning all things bad into all things good. Ultimately, he's making all things new. You see, the truth is we may never fully understand why God allows us to suffer in the ways that we do. Job didn't. We get to the end of the book. Job is never given an explanation as to why he suffered what he suffered. I mean, God could have at least, if he were a gentleman, could have at least said to Job, listen, buddy, let me just give you a heads up. Tomorrow, you're going to lose everything, okay? But there's a reason for it, and this is what I'm going to bring out of it. This is what I'm going to do for you in it, and this is how you are actually going to be more alive and more free when it's all over. So brace yourself. I got you, but I'm just giving you a heads up. He could have done that. He didn't. And then when you get to the end of the book, God could have said, you know, Job, I should have told you this on the front end, but at the very least, I'll tell you on the back end. This is why you went through everything you went through. See all the good stuff that's come out of this? You see me in a different way, and you see yourself in a different way. You're more alive. You're more free. You suffered tremendous calamity, and you suffered tremendous loss, but look at what's come out of it. And look at who you now are as a result of it. He could have done, never, ever gives Job a peek behind the curtain. Never gives him an explanation. So we may never fully understand why God allows us to suffer in the ways that we do. But listen, we don't need answers and explanations as much as we need God with us when we're suffering. Let me put it to you this way. It's not relief that we ultimately need. It's God. It's not answers that we ultimately need. It's God. It's not a problem-free life that we ultimately need. It's God. God is. In fact, as we make our way through this series, what we're going to see is that suffering and pain and failure are the things God uses to produce the most good in us and the most good for us. Think about it. Empathy, humility, wisdom, emotional intelligence, insight, compassion, a deeper love. None of these things are developed apart from pain. None of them. You know the difference between sympathy and empathy. Sympathy is, I hear what you're saying. Empathy is, I feel what you're feeling because I've been there. I mean, it takes compassion to be sympathetic, but you can't be empathetic apart from suffering. You can't. Having experienced catastrophe myself and crashing and burning myself, I think back now to situations and to people that I handled in a particular way before my crash and burn, and sometimes I think about those things and cringe. I didn't have the empathy then that I have now. Now when people crash and burn, they run to me. Because I've not only talked about my own crash and burn, but man, I feel it. When they talk about loss, when they talk about hopelessness, when they talk about pain and regret and guilt and shame, I feel that stuff. I don't just hear it and go, oh man, I feel it. Well, none of that would have happened apart from my own crash and burn. None of it. I think the stuff that I am most grateful to God for in terms of what He's produced in me has come as a result of loss, pain, suffering. It was Dostoevsky who said, pain and suffering are always inevitable for a large intelligence and a deep heart. How true is that? Improvement by affliction is a common theme in the Bible. It's a common theme in life, but it's especially a common theme in the Bible. I mean, like biological life, one of the paradoxes of the Christian life is that vitality requires pruning. Resurrection requires death. And this means that all our suffering happens ultimately because God loves us and has as His goal for us a deeper vitality, a spiritual enlargement, a freer life. This is why Charles Spurgeon said, one of my favorite quotes of all time, these heavy troubles are heralds of weighty mercies. These heavy troubles are announcers, heralds, proclaimers of weighty mercies. So what we need most is the presence of God, not the absence of suffering. What we need more than anything is to see God, to know God present in our suffering. God is always working behind the scenes in the rubble of our lives, always showing us who He is, reminding us of His faithfulness, reminding us of His provision. When we can't see it, when we can't feel it, God's there. He's doing it. When He seems silent, He's not. When He seems absent, He's not. He's always present, and He's always loving us, always through our greatest pains and providing us all that we need, including the space to cry and yell and grieve and shout and question and doubt and all that stuff. In fact, it's in desperation and weakness that we see God in brand new, bright, and liberating ways. Because when you get to the end of Job, the very end, okay, Job has suffered all of the calamities that he has suffered, cataclysmic losses in ways that most of us will never experience. And he suffers these losses in such a painful way. And you get to the end, and we'll get to his friends. His friends, they're real pieces of work, okay? They show up to comfort him and do the exact opposite. Essentially, what they say to him is, Job, this is how the world works. Bad people get bad stuff. Good people get good stuff. You're clearly getting bad stuff. What did you do wrong, Job? Go ahead, tell us. We are your self-appointed accountability group, and we want to see the skeletons in your closet. Show us. And Job's like, the hell are you guys talking about, man? I haven't done anything wrong. You're not helping me at all. And they go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And in the process of Job's friends attacking Job, Job gets really defensive. And now he starts getting angry at God. Well, you get through all of that stuff, all of it, and you get to the end of Job. And we'll get to this too. This is one of my favorite books in the Bible. You get to chapter 38, and God's been listening patiently to these yahoos going back and forth, speculating about things they didn't understand. And God just sitting there probably rolling his eyes going, oh my gosh, these guys are such idiots, okay? And finally, in chapter 38, God breaks his silence. And he says, okay, Job, you've questioned me. Now brace yourself like a man because I'm about to question you. And he said, answer this question. Where were you when I was laying the foundations of the earth? Where were you when I was telling the lightning where to strike and the thunder where to roll? Where were you when I was creating fish so deep in the ocean that only I can see them? Where were you? Surely you know if there's any place in the Bible that sanctions sarcasm, it's there. God is being incredibly sarcastic with Job in that chapter. Like, come on, tell me. You think you're a know-it-all? Then tell me. Tell me, I mean, you think you've got it all figured out? Then tell me, where were you? Where were you when I was speaking the world into existence and putting the stars exactly where I want them? Where were you? And after God's series of questions to Job, Job finally speaks. And this is what he says. My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. Well, that's all you need to know. That's it. Now, the other stuff that comes along with, Job at the end gets all of his stuff back, not all of his original stuff back, but, he gets remarried and he has more kids and he becomes rich again and, he gets a double portion of what he had before, the Bible says. But that's not the real blessing. The real blessing, the real benefit of Job's pain is he's gone from knowing about God to knowing God. It's gone from sort of hearing about God to seeing God. You see, the road from knowing about God to knowing God, from hearing to seeing, is paved in suffering and loss. Paved in it. There is simply no other way to be truly set free from our innate sense of self-sufficiency. Suffering reminds us how not in control we are, how little we can control, and how much we need God. And even though we may not be able to trace God's hand, we can always trust his heart. I used the illustration a few weeks ago with regard to my dad. How my dad's character was so robust. He died in 2010, was one of my best friends, one of my chief advisors and counselors throughout my entire life. And if someone would have told me when he was alive that they saw him coming out of some woman's apartment at midnight, I might not be able to tell you what he was doing there, but I could certainly tell you what he wasn't doing there because I knew my dad. So we look at our lives and we look at this world and we're not going to be able to figure out what God is doing. But we can say for certain what he's not doing. He's not being unloving. He's not being not good. He's not failing us. He hasn't abandoned us. I don't know what he is doing, but there is something that God is doing in the midst of your pain right now, in the midst of your regret right now, in the midst of your loss and your suffering and your calamity right now. You can't see it, you may not feel it, but I promise you it's good. It's good. And you may not ever fully see that good benefit this side of heaven. But it's good. He's developing you. He's deepening you. He's fashioning you. He's making you, remaking you. He's bringing you to life. He's bringing you to life in ways that make you feel like he's putting you to death. William Cowper was an 18th century hymnist and poet. And he suffered terribly with depression his whole life. And on 3 separate occasions, he tried to kill himself. And after one of his failed suicide attempts, he wrote the hymn, God Moves in Mysterious Ways. Listen to this. God moves in a mysterious way, his wonders to perform. He plants his footsteps in the sea and rides upon the storm. Deep in unfathomable minds of never-failing skill, he treasures up his bright designs and works his sovereign will. Ye fearful saints, fresh courage take. The clouds you so much dread are big with mercy and shall break in blessings on your head. Judge not the Lord by feeble sense, but trust him for his grace. Behind a frowning providence, he hides a smiling face. There's no better place to see God's smiling face behind a frowning providence than the cross. I mean, what a tragedy, right? This innocent man, falsely accused, wrongly condemned to die, did nothing wrong. The only person who ever lived who did nothing wrong. And he's being punished like he's a common thief. And I can only imagine that Jesus' friends and family members that were watching his trial and his torture and ultimately his crucifixion are sitting there going, this is a tragedy. Of all the people falsely condemned to die, it's this guy? He was nothing but good to me. He was the best friend I ever had. He was the best son. He was a great teacher. He was selfless. He was caring. Why? A frowning providence. But behind it was this smiling divine face going, I am making all things new. This death will bring about the resurrection of the cosmic order. You will be made alive because he is being put to death. He was condemned as a slave and a criminal in order to set you free and give you a clean record. His blood and his death secures your pardon. Secures it. And because of this apparent tragedy, you now live your life under a banner that reads, it is finished. And there is nothing you can do or fail to do that will ever tempt God to leave you or forsake you. You are clothed in a straitjacket of forgiveness. You are locked in a cage of pardon. And there's nothing you can do about it. You can't wiggle your way free of God's love. You cannot out-sin the coverage of God's forgiveness. It's an impossibility because of that apparent tragedy. Behind a frowning providence, God hides a smiling face.